things that we're going to talk about today is obviously, as the slide says up here, identifying, labeling, and marking CUI. And there's a lot of complications to that. It's not really as simple as it sounds. So I'm going to go ahead and I added this meme over here to kind of throw a little bit of humor into it. That I think we can all agree that as contractors, it's our responsibility to mark CUI accordingly. And I think the biggest problem that I see in the defense industrial base is sometimes we will receive information from the government or our primes, and that information you think could potentially be CUI, but it's not marked appropriately, and there's various reasons for that. Sometimes, the government or even those primes don't know the information that they've given you is CUI, and one of the more common problems is you'll have CUI that was not marked, and as contracting officers come in and out, they just continue this vicious cycle of not marking it. So eventually, it just boils its way all the way down to the defense industrial base. So hopefully I'm going to help with identifying, labeling, and marking CUI to the best of my ability. And again, there's a lot of gray area here, but I'm going to give you what I think would be probably the best perspective. So if you have CUI in your environment as a defense industrial base, as a contractor, you probably have triggered the DFARS 7012 clause in your contract. And if you're going to flow that information down to your subcontractors per the DFARS 7012 clause under subsection M, it is your responsibility as that contractor to flow the DFARS 7012 clause language into that contractual agreement in its entirety. And the reason I say that is there are contractors out there, primes in particular, that they are taking the DFARS 7012 clause that they've received, they're rewording it, and then they're flowing it down to their subcontractors, which is a big no-no. They're supposed to flow down the entirety of the clause to you, which leads to scoping. And when you have scoping when you have CUI in your environment, as you start to flow down CUI to your different contractors and subs, that boundary starts getting bigger. But as you can identify what CUI is in your environment, you'll be able to limit that scope and be able to focus all your precious time and resources to those assets that require protection. Now, what's supposed to be marked? Now, I've listed here 2 authoritative sources. Who here has heard of the DoD Instruction 5248? All right, not very many hands. All right, so first and foremost, right, I think back in May, Jacob Horn did a great video on the fascinating history of CMMC, and where they talk about the CUI program can be traced back as far as the post 9/11 Commission report, where agencies were just having issues just sharing information. And so eventually in 2010, President Obama issued Executive Order 13556, which then eventually led to 32 CFR Part 2002, which was a CUI program. In that regulation, the 32 CFR outlines that the CUI executive agent for the entire CUI program is the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. And the NARA delegated that authority down to the Information Security Oversight Office. Now, and the reason I bring up DoD Instruction 5248 is because it is not, at the moment, this is not applicable to contractors yet, but this is the DoD's policy on how they're going to mark and handle and safeguard CUI within the DoD that, in my opinion, will eventually get flowed down to contractors at some point. So what's supposed to be marked? So in order for you to have CUI in your environment in the first place, you have to have a contract. Okay, so we're going to just take it from the premise of you are the prime contractor. Okay, under FAR 52.204-21, federal contract information has 2 elements to it. It's information not intended for public release, and you're developing or delivering a product or service to the government under that contract. Those are the 2 elements that are required. By adding the third element of the information meets one of the CUI categories definitions, once you put all 3 elements together, you now have CUI in your environment. All right, so who's supposed to mark CUI? So in 32 CFR Part 2002, there's a couple of definitions that everyone needs to understand. You as a contractor handling CUI are considered an authorized holder. An authorized holder is an individual, agency, or organization that is permitted to either designate or handle CUI. So I need you guys to understand that. If you're handling CUI right now in your environment in the performance of a contract, you are an authorized holder. When do the OSCs need to market and when do they not? So if the authorized holder determines that a specific piece of information falls into one of the CUI categories, then it is your job to designate it as CUI. And we'll get to that. We'll get into that ball of craziness here in a second. Also, and when to not market. So the one thing that I do not want OSCs out there to do not look at every single piece of information in your environment and say, well, that's tax information, that falls under the CUI category, I have to mark that as CUI, or this is this other type of information in the CUI category, that's CUI, right? It has to meet those three elements, right? It has to be information not intended for public release, you're developing or delivering a product or service to the government under that contract, and it meets one of the definitions. All three elements must be present. And also, as I stated when I first started, sometimes the DoD or even your primes will give information to you that you think could be CUI, but is not. And so in 32 CFR Part 2002, under the marking section, just because that information lacks the CUI marking does not exempt you as the authorized holder from abiding by the applicable handling requirements, which means safeguarding and marking. Does anybody have any questions so far? All right, so I always like to do these little scenarios to kind of help people put themselves in the shoes of where they are in the defense industrial base. So I want you guys to picture yourselves as ABC Manufacturing. You win a DoD contract to develop rocket engines, and the DoD puts the DFARS 7012 clause within your contract. The DoD then provides you with drawings that falls under controlled technical information to help create that product, but it is not marked. Are you, as a contractor, responsible for marking that information? Yes. And the answer is yes, as we stated, right? In that 32 CFR Part 2002 under the marking, simply because it lacks the CUI marking does not exempt you from abiding by the handling requirements. Now let's go ahead and add, we'll throw a little curveball in here. Same exact scenario, right? You win a DoD contract to develop those rocket engines for the DoD, and they include the DFARS 7012 clause in your contract. Now, part of your business processes is you run background checks on your employees, which means sometimes you're going to have to collect social security numbers, right, in order to verify things like previous employment history, credit history, criminal history, and so on. In the CUI registry, there is a CUI category called general privacy, and it calls out personally identifiable information. So, are you, as the contractor, responsible for marking that PII as CUI? Who said yes? The answer is no. The reason why, you do not have a contract with the government to deliver a product or service that requires you to process that PII. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit on how we're going to mark CUI. So the primary authoritative guide for marking CUI at the moment is the NARA CUI Marking Handbook. Okay, in the handbook, it talks about that the primary marking for all CUI is that CUI marking banner. And you're going to see that the difference is here between how NARA is going to do it and how eventually the DoD wants you to do it. So what they're stating here is, at the top of the documents, they want the CUI marking to appear at the top of the page in the header, and they want it as an optional best practice to place in the footer, whereas eventually DoD instruction is telling you those documents will be marked header and footer as a requirement. Anybody have any questions on this? All right, so here is where I'm going to put my provisional assessor hat on, and we're going to go through one of the practices to be able to show you what quote-unquote right looks like from my perspective. Okay, so we're going to talk about MP.3.122, and this aligns back with NIST 800-171. And so when we're talking about this control, it has two assessment objectives. The first one is, right, media containing CUI is marked with the applicable CUI markings, and then the Bravo assessment objective is the media containing CUI is marked with any distribution limitations on it. When you're reading in the CMMC assessment guide, under the further discussion, it talks about all media, hard copy and digital must be properly marked. Now, this next part, this is the core of the purpose of this practice. It is to alert individuals to the presence of CUI on media. That is the whole purpose of this practice. In the CMMC appendices guide, media is defined up there, and there's a couple of things, right? Magnetic disc, optical discs, and magnetic tapes. But I want you guys to focus in on magnetic discs because we're going to get to a very controversial topic here in a few. All right, so in the CMMC assessment guide, one of the things that they brought up was that NARA published guidelines for marking various types of CUI, right? And so essentially what NARA did, right, they issued the CUI notice 2019-01, and they basically stated that if you're using any of these optional form documents, they have been discontinued and they've been consolidated into this document on your far left, which is that standard form 901 cover sheet. The label in the middle, the standard form 902, is going to be for things like your external hard drives. And then the label all the way on the right, standard form 903, is going to be for things like your flash drives and thumb drives. So here's an example how this is an example of how the DoD is going to want you to mark CUI documents in the future. So as you can see at the very top and bottom, right, CUI is listed at the very top and bottom. This is a requirement per the DoD instruction that'll eventually come down. Another thing that's required will be the CUI designation indicator block, right? That's got 5 components, right? The name of the DoD component, the identity of the office creating that document. And you notice here, this is where this is one of the biggest differences between how NARA marks CUI versus how the DoD marks it. So NARA marks CUI that for the purposes of this presentation, we have controlled technical information in our environment. The way NARA marks it is CUI/SP-CTI at the top of the document. Whereas DoD says, no, we only want you to mark CUI top and bottom and put the category in the CUI designator indicator box. And notice they want you to put the acronym. They don't want you spelling it out. That's another one of their pet peeves. One of the other blocks in here is going to be your distribution statements or limited dissemination controls. So, for the purposes of this presentation, there aren't any, but if this was no foreign dissemination, no foreign would go right there. And then last but not least, the name and either the phone number or the office mailbox, including their email, of the authorized holder, point of contact. Portion marking is optional. However, if you are going to portion mark, you have to portion mark the entire document. Okay? So, and one of the biggest changes that you're going to see with DoD Instruction 5248 is it will be a requirement to portion mark unclassified information to be able to distinguish what is CUI and what is not. So when you're marking PowerPoint documents, okay, the top and bottom of the documents are going to be marked with CUI in that title slide, as well as the CUI indicator designation box. Every slide after that only needs to have CUI marked top and bottom. The title slide is supposed to have this CUI designation indicator box. Everything after that is just top and bottom. Now, when marking email attachments, again, this is one of the key differences on how DoD is going to want you to mark stuff. So the body of the email is supposed to have CUI at the top and the bottom of the body of the email and the CUI designation indicator block. And then it's optional best practice to include the brackets contain CUI in the subject line and in the file attachments if you're going to include any files. Now, this is one of the ones that it surprised me. I noticed that there are a lot of companies out there that do fax CUI. And so I figured I'd go ahead and just talk about it. And the two requirements is the very top of it in that block is stating that when that enclosure is removed, then that enclosure is unclassified, uncontrolled, unclassified information, which means you could discard that document. Just toss it in the trash. It's not CUI. However, in the comments right there at the bottom, you notice how it says the attachment contains CUI. So everything after this cover page is going to be CUI documents. Now, when it comes to marking media, right, in the CUI NARA marking handbook, and again, these are a couple of the differences, right? Media like USB sticks, the hard drives. There's that word again, to alert holders to the presence of CUI stored on the device. Right? That's the whole purpose of that practice. And there's going to be times where you're going to have things like flash drives that's going to have CUI on it, where you can't put the entire category on there. You're just going to have to put CUI in the designating agency. And so I've listed a couple of examples in here of what appropriately marked CUI media looks like. So you can see the flash drive there, how it's marked. It only has CUI in it because you can't add anything else to it. CD, mark CUI at the top with the designating agency at the bottom, and then your external hard drives on how that's marked with that standard form 902 label. Now, this is the part of the point of contention that we're going to get into. So in that NARA CUI marking handbook, it states that equipment can be marked or labeled to indicate that CUI is stored on the device. So does that mean for laptops? In 32 CFR Part 2002, it states that when it is impractical for an agency to individually mark CUI due to either the quantity or nature of the information, the authorized holder must use an alternate marking method to include, one of the examples that they give is a computer system digital splash screen. So as contractors, which do? Do you mark laptops with CUI stickers, or do you use a system digital splash screen? Who said both? and the correct answer is there is no right answer, right? There is no right answer, because CUI stickers is a way to mark. It is not the only way to mark, right? But this goes back to, when in doubt, go back to your contracting officer, point this out, because as it's stated in this previous slide, right, who gets to determine what's impractical, right? Who gets to determine the quantity of the information? So for example, if you have 500 documents, is it impractical to individually mark all 500 documents? It depends on who you are. If you have a very nitpicky KO, probably they're going to say they want you to mark everything, and some of them will say, no, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and mark it with the, put a sign in the storage area and call it a day, right? But you have to control that information as it is. All right, when it comes to shipping and labeling CUI, I want people to understand that this is not just documentation. You're not just shipping and marking documents, right? CUI can be that widget. That is CUI. That finished product is CUI. If you're going to ship it, right, you can use the United States Postal Service or a third-party commercial service like FedEx, UPS, or DHL. And also, right, I also highlighted there, you should, as an optional best practice, use those tracking numbers to keep track of it and maintain accountability. All right, when you're sending packages off, right, they want you to only specify to who it's going to. Do not mark the documents on the outside with the CUI markings, because you're going to alert unauthorized users to the presence of CUI.